In his biography, Lady Sybil, Simon Boyd has given us a fascinating glimpse into the life and times of this Northumbrian woman. Born before cars and aeroplanes, she lived to see the beginning of the space age. And much of the book is in her own words and diaries and letters. And so it's both a personal account of her story and one which describes the huge world events that spanned her lifetime. These include the end of the Victorian and Edwardian eras, 2 world wars, the Russian Revolution, and more. And so without more ado, I'm delighted to welcome Simon Boyd, who will tell us the story of Lady Sybil Grey.
Thank you very much, Anna, and hello. And I'll begin with her words as she set out on a night voyage from Newcastle across the North Sea in October 1915. She wrote to her parents, "I can hardly believe that I've really left you and started out. Russia seemed such a long way away. I'm very frightened, but it's a wonderful opportunity, and it's up to me to prove myself worthy of it. If I don't, I shall have only myself to blame. How thrilling and exciting it ought to be." The young woman was Lady Sybil Grey, my grandmother, 33 years old, single, brave, and very determined. She was dedicated to her mission, set up a British hospital in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, in the middle of the First World War. What fitted her for the role of setting up and organizing a military hospital thousands of miles from home? And what gave her the courage and self-confidence to take it on? She was born in 1882, second daughter of Albert IV Earl Grey. She had an immensely privileged upbringing at Berwick Hall near Alnwick in Northumberland. And a sense of duty and responsibility was instilled into her from a young age. Her grandfather was personal secretary to Queen Victoria, and her great-grandfather, the second Earl Grey, was the Liberal Prime Minister who brought in the Great Electoral Reform Act, 1832. On her mother's side, her other grandfather was Robert Stainer Holford, MP, a very celebrated art collector and the builder of 2 great houses, Dorchester House in London and Weston Burt in Gloucestershire, now the home of the National Arboretum. But Howick was her spiritual home, a place of beauty and an anchor throughout her life. And she said, "I was very fortunate to be born of well-to-do parents and lived in a lovely house and park. But what mattered far more was that I was a member of a devoted family. And my father tried to teach us the greatest happiness in life is to serve others." He had an active life, outdoor life, a bit of a tomboy, fishing, riding ponies, biking, playing hockey for Howick against Alnwick. And one of Sybil's early memories, age 12, was being driven down to Alnwick in a pony trap to buy a child's book about the French Revolution. And I wonder whether she remembered this when she faced a revolution herself 23 years later.
So it's really interesting that, in fact, Lady Sybil Grey was your grandmother. It would be good to hear a little about your own memories of her and also how you think this upbringing affected her character and developed those qualities which enabled her to take on the adventures of her later life.
Well, my boyhood memories are of a warm, loving grandmother, of staying with her at her home in Burley in the New Forest, of games in the garden, of painting with her, and visits to the sea at Muddyford. But there was a real steeliness to her character as well. She owned a sword stick, which I found fascinating, a polished Malacca cane, which if grabbed by an attacker all the way to reveal a deadly sharp rapier which remained in her hand. And I like to believe that she traveled to Russia with it as protection. And she was greatly influenced by her father and his dedication to public service, also by her mother, from whom she inherited a passion for gardening. And the empire was at its height in Sybil's youth, and in her schoolroom at home, where she was taught by a governess, hung a motto: "What is my country? The empire is my country. England is my home." And her father, Earl Grey, was one of its great protagonists. And a friend of his said he loved the empire as the most beautiful thing under heaven, the supreme achievement of British genius. Not perhaps how the empire is always seen nowadays, and no one now would want to go back to the days of empire. But I do hear an idealism in Earl Grey's vision of the empire.
So clearly an aristocratic family, a country family, and one with a long history of their view of patriotism and political connections over many generations.
The Greys were an important political family. Their cousin, Sir Edward Grey, who was later to become Viscount Falodon, was Foreign Secretary before and during much of the First World War. And politics was part of everyday life for Sybil and remained an enduring interest for her throughout her life. And among Earl Grey's many facets were his commitment to the betterment of workers, and he founded the Howick Cooperative in 1895, and it continued in existence till 1970. And he was strongly committed to Irish unionism, on which he split from the Liberal Party, and also to the case for proportional representation, which of course has never come in. And he promoted the movement for garden cities. And his wide circle included writers such as Kipling and Rider Haggard, and politicians like President Theodore Roosevelt and Sun Yat-sen, first democratic leader of China. And he served the empire first as administrator for Rhodesia, and then as Governor General of Canada. And above all, Sybil was influenced by Canada, where she went to live at the age of 22, when her father became Governor General. And she fell in love with the country, where she lived for 7 years. And she was awed by its vast size and the can-do attitude of its people, determined to work hard and to succeed. She particularly loved fishing in its mighty rivers. And years later, 50 years later, she declared, "If I were a young man now, I think I'd emigrate to Canada, that land of sunshine and illimitable possibilities."
So traveling, seeing the world, Canada in particular, she was very well prepared perhaps for the life that was awaiting her when she went to Russia.
Yes, I think she was. She accompanied her father on his travels to Canada's remotest region, the Yukon, scene of the Klondike gold rush just a decade before, helping her father with his official duties. And Canada was her apprenticeship for a world of challenges and for embracing new countries and for dealing with all kinds of people. And it prepared her for serving her country in faraway places in the First World War.
And of course, by 1914, by the start of 1914, Europe was getting ready for that war. And Sybil, with her upbringing and background, would have seen her duty to be a patriot and to take part in the preparations for war.
Yes, at the start of the war, she volunteered as a VAD, a voluntary aid detachment support nurse, and she received pretty rudimentary training at Newcastle Royal in Victoria Infirmary, where, to her surprise, she found that the sight of gory wounds, like raw, empty eye sockets, didn't put her off at all. And after serving as commandant of Howick Hall Hospital at her father's house in the country, you can see that on screen at the moment, she was selected to go and set up the Anglo-Russian hospital in Petrograd. And this was a gift from Britain to the Russians in the Great War. Treat ordinary Russian soldiers, not officers. It was intended to be a 200-bed hospital, fully equipped, staffed by British doctors and nurses. It was backed by the King and the Queen, with a huge committee of 80, including the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, and presided over by Lady Muriel Paget, its creator and driving force. It was paid for by British cities and by public subscription in Britain.
So we're given a clear picture of her strength of character, her patriotic sense of duty, but it's interesting that actually she didn't do a full nursing training at the RVI in Newcastle, and one can't help but wonder if it was an undisputed decision to send this young woman, aristocratic, only partly trained, as commandant of the Anglo-Russian hospital in Petrograd in a time of war.
Well, you've put it very well. It certainly wasn't undisputed. The British Journal of Nursing objected vocally to her appointment and said, why has a young, untrained girl been placed in this responsible position when a lady of title, backed by social influence, is in supreme authority in a military hospital? Disorganization in the nursing department is inevitable. By that time, Sybil and her advance party were already on their way, and she went on to prove her critics wrong by acquitting herself very well in Russia. And she was also very careful not to trespass on the preserve of the matron or the nurses, who were rightly jealous of their professional status. And I am really amazed by her courage. She was going off to a foreign country she didn't know, a war zone, thousands of miles from home, risking injury or death when she visited the front.
So she left by boat from Newcastle in October and arrived in Russia at the start of the long Russian winter in wartime. What did she make of Russia and Petrograd when she arrived?
Well, she and her companions arrived in Petrograd, which was then capital of Russia, and they were in an alien country with a difficult language, a completely unfamiliar alphabet, and an antiquated dating system that lagged 13 days behind the rest of Europe. And the political system was utterly different from Britain. The peasantry had only been freed from serfdom 50 years before, and the Duma, which was the parliament, was just a rubber stamp for the Tsar's autocratic rule. And it was really like taking a step back in time to a different world, to England in the 1640s in the Civil War, or France in the 1780s, both countries on the brink of their own revolutions. And the winter was the coldest since 1812. Hundreds of hospitals were already being set up in Petrograd. Thousands of soldiers flooded the streets, and there were hundreds of thousands of refugees. Sybil wrote, they lived in huge barns, all huddled together in mud and filth, babies dying of pneumonia, women having children, scarlet fever and measles quite prevalent. These are the most fortunate of the refugees. Thousands upon thousands are dying on the roads. In spite of this, you might say, strangely, she found Petrograd stunningly beautiful, with the dome of St. Isaac's Cathedral gleaming with gold, and the splendid Winter Palace silhouetted in snow beside the Neva River. And finding a site for the hospital wasn't that easy, but a royal palace fitted the bill perfectly on the Nevsky Prospect, great boulevard in the heart of Petrograd. The palace was owned by Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a young, rather dissolute first cousin of the Tsar, who then went on later to murder Rasputin.
So even from today's perspective, I can see this was a huge task for a young woman to undertake on her own in wartime, in a country where she didn't speak the language, and she was converting a royal palace into a hospital, managing large numbers of staff. So how unusual was Sybil for her time?
Well, up to this point, she didn't really fit what was expected of young ladies of her class at the time. And she hadn't married at the age very young or had children in her 20s. And both her sisters and brother had done that. Perhaps she was really searching for more than the restricted role normally available to women then. But oddly, she didn't fit our modern expectations either, because she didn't, so far as I can see, support the suffragettes, for instance. Mm-hmm. And nothing is really known about her love life, if any, before she married at the age of 40, except a tantalizing glimpse of an engagement that failed to materialize to a mysterious Lord E. And the First World War provided her, and other women actually, with the opportunity to serve her country, and kindled her interest in nursing, and revealed her ability to manage people, including doctors who were much older than herself. But first, they had to convert the palace into a hospital, changing its grand rooms into wards with operating theatres and a laboratory, even a small morgue.
And when you look at that picture, it's very clear, as when reading her life in Petrograd, that along with her work as commandant of the hospital, she was still a privileged young woman who was enjoying life at the highest level of Russian society.
Well, she certainly enjoyed the pleasures of social life in Petrograd. She was invited to concerts, the ballet, and the opera, and she gambled late at night, which is what Russian high society did then. But she was essentially serious and purposeful, and a clear-eyed observer of a decaying and collapsing society. And she met the Empress, Alexandra Feodorovna, on a personal visit to the Tsarina's palace, and she described their encounter. She said she got up and came to meet me dressed as a nurse, and she looked very handsome, utterly different to what I'd expected. I'd expected a cold, tragic face with all the life gone out of it. Instead, it was a beautiful face, beautiful English, and very easy to get on with. But somehow one came away with a heavy heart, and thanking God one wasn't an empress, particularly this one. There was an atmosphere about her which cried out for sympathy. I've never felt it so strong with anyone. And the Anglo-Russian hospital was opened on the 1st of February, 1916. And the Tsarina and her 4 daughters attended and were photographed with Lady Sybil, British ambassador, and the staff of the hospital. And it was a splendid success. Just 2 years later, of course, the Tsarina and her daughters and her husband and son would be murdered and their bloodied corpses flung down an abandoned mine shaft in the Urals. And Sybil also heard disturbing stories about the callousness of the Russian army. Russian general told how they solved the problem of having too many prisoners to transport across the lake by turning their machine guns on the 5,000 prisoners, reducing their number to 2,000. These could be more easily dealt with. And Sybil commented, not surprisingly, a nasty story, isn't it? Not one for our side to publish. Shortly after they began to take in patients, a boy Cossack walked in and said he wanted a meal. And he was aged 12, and he had on his top boots, his greatcoat down to the ground, his little sword and his Cossack whip by his side, and a rather big soldier's cap on his fat head. And Sybil was vastly amused and very taken with him, but commented, I wonder why they allowed these babies in the firing line. And in May, Lady Muriel Paget arrived and took charge, and Sybil went on to organize and lead the first field hospital to the front.
So she left Petrograd and she went off on her adventures, and it would be a very different experience away in the field of war, very different from life in the capital. Do you think she enjoyed this other life?
Yes, I think she did. And it was different. She was with the army at the front, on the move, and in the open air. And they set off in a huge train composed of 37 coaches, containing 105 horses, 125 Russian orderlies, 44 transport carts and ambulances, all horse-drawn, 2 kitchens on wheels, and 19 staff, including doctors, nurses, cooks, their Russian nachalnik, their commandant. And they traveled by train, road, and on horseback, positioning themselves as close to the front as possible. And although it was the height of summer, it was bitterly cold at night. And she described their journey with a mixture of humor and relish for the challenge of hard travel. And I do think that this was probably her high point in Russia, being at the front, involved with the glamour of an army on the move. And she wrote, occasionally, a most ornamental Cossack would gallop past. There's very little doubt indeed that someday I will elope with a Cossack. And Matron described her, Lady Sybil riding astride at the head of our caravan with a group of Russian potentates. Felt as if we were all part of a comic opera.
That's quite a strong image of Lady Sybil at the head. And I was intrigued because there's a little footnote here in your book that tells about a fortune teller that she met 3 years later, who told Sybil that she was unlike any woman she had ever met. And she told her this was because she had been a man in 7 previous incarnations, and she had fought as a soldier. I think this is a very interesting comment about Sybil.
Yes. Well, the fortune-telling incident was odd, and in a way, so was the fact that she kept this record of it in her papers. And the fortune teller was clearly highly inventive. But I think that Sybil felt that she did have some masculine strengths of character. And I'm absolutely certain that she enjoyed her time with the field hospital and her wartime service in Russia. But first, a disaster struck. Sybil was accidentally wounded in the face by a Russian hand grenade. She was taken back to Petrograd to be operated on. Now a patient in her own hospital. Her parents, of course, were horrified. What a fright you've given us. Bad enough having one's own son at the front, but to have a daughter too in the firing zone is really too much. And she returned to England to recover for 3 months. And the English Dowager Queen Alexandra wrote a letter to her father. How shocked you must have been when you heard that your poor daughter was wounded, like a soldier. But excuse me, I'm sure the dear girl ought never to have gone where she did. And in October 1916, fully recovered, Sybil returned to Russia, an action which must have taken courage on her part and even more on the part of her parents.
And again, I think it was very brave of her to leave Howick Hall and go back to the front again. And on her return, revolution was brewing. And it must have been very different, even from a few months earlier. And she describes events in some detail when she went back.
Yes, it was very different. The Tsar's regime was on its last legs. There were terrible food shortages. The country was sapped by military defeat, by the Tsarina's meddling in government, and by incompetent ministers. But perhaps above all by Grigory Rasputin, the dissolute so-called holy man, who had a hold over the Tsarina because he claimed to be able to cure her son's haemophilia. The murder of Rasputin followed soon afterwards. It was carried out by Prince Felix Yusupov and by Sybil's landlord, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich. And it was a pretty incompetent affair. They first tried to kill Rasputin using poisoned cakes and wine, which didn't succeed. And then they went on to shoot him and beat him before finally dumping him in the river, where he ultimately drowned. And there are even unproven suggestions that Britain's nascent secret intelligence service, the SIS, had a hand in the killing. And after the murder, the killers took shelter in the hospital, and Pavlovich handed Sybil the only key to his private apartments, telling her to give it to no one. And she wore it under her dress for 3 weeks, remarking, "It was the only time that I've ever sheltered a murderer." As you say, by this time, everyone knew a revolution was coming. It was just a question of when. People were literally starving and freezing to death in the street while queuing overnight to buy bread. And Sybil, an earl's daughter, exploded, "It's damnable. If I were a Russian, I'd be a red-hot revolutionary." Although a natural conservative, she was exasperated with the Tsar's regime. And she said, "The whole country is corrupt. I can't think how they will ever get straight."
So there she was, living through these momentous events. But again, she has written some really interesting little anecdotes about daily life during the revolution. I wonder, can you give us some examples of these?
Yes, the revolution broke out soon afterwards, and Sybil recorded it day by day in a tattered notebook, which I've still got. And I'll give a selection of the events it described. It started with a woman breaking the window of a bread shop to get bread. And the general stopped, remonstrated with her, and he in turn was attacked by the crowd. Cossack officers refused an order to charge the crowds with their swords, saying, "The people are only asking for bread." And on the 11th of March, Revolution Day broke bright and sunny, and from a window, Sybil witnessed soldiers shoot into a crowd of peaceful people on the bridge outside the hospital. 10 casualties were brought in, and 3 died almost immediately. And Sybil commented, "Soldiers had fired on the people. Now nothing could stop the revolution." Taxis and motor cars with men with rifles on the running boards drove up and down the street, guns firing. There was heavy fighting. Staff hung Red Cross flags made from an old Father Christmas costume outside the door of the Anglo-Russian hospital. She told the story of a young officer accompanied by revolutionary troops who marched in, pointed a revolver at her chest, and ordered her to take charge of large stocks of wine to prevent the revolution from degenerating into a drunken orgy. She'd never been offered wine at gunpoint. Finally, on the 15th of March, 1917, the emperor abdicated with his son. Revolutionary flags were hoisted on the Winter Palace, and the double-headed Romanov eagles were torn down. And she commented, "The revolution succeeded because all classes were in sympathy with the revolutionaries in overthrowing an incompetent and hated government."
And what happened to the hospital? And what did the Anglo-Russian hospital, and what did Sybil do next?
Well, the revolution continued for 9 months at least, until the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917. But Sybil left Russia at the end of March to return home to nurse her dying father. Her friends in Petrograd valued her calm, good sense and her canniness. They called her the Grey Fox, and they lamented her departure, saying, "Who will clear our minds for us now that you've gone?" And the Anglo-Russian hospital soldiered on until January 1918. And in the course of its 2-year service, it treated many thousands of Russian wounded, and its remaining staff were evacuated by Lady Paget in an epic journey right across Russia, Vladivostok on the Pacific, and home via the USA.
But Sybil didn't stay home, did she, in Howick Hall? What did she do instead?
She went on to lead the Women's Legion in France in 1919, a detachment of the army providing 500 female drivers and ambulance and staff car drivers. And they worked all across the shattered landscape of Flanders and northern France, with Sybil persuading skeptical officers that women could do the job and sorting out the consequences when her girls fell in love with the young officers they drove for. And at the age of 40, she married my grandfather, Lambert Middleton, her father's banker, whose family owned Belfsey Hall near Newcastle. And she became Lady Sybil Middleton, as I knew her, and raised her family, my uncle Harry and my mother Molly. And Sybil and Lambert were well known to each other for many years, and they were very well suited. And they both wanted children, and they realized it was their last chance to have them. They were both in their 40s. And they shared a quirky sense of humor and outlook on life. And they lived as a family at Lowood near Melrose in the borders of Scotland, where my mother grew up and later met my father, who lived a few miles away at Whitetree. But Lambert was also a sick man, and Sybil increasingly became his carer. And at times it must have felt like a constraint, I think, to her. She was used to travel and a very active life. She put her energy into caring for her husband and into her other passions, raising her children, planting beautiful gardens, fishing, and into a very modern hobby, photography and amateur film. And many years later, quite by chance, one of her films of the village of Darnick in Scotland was found in a sale and screened on TV as an anonymous masterpiece of amateur cinema. And Sybil and Lambert had a wide circle of friends and relatives, friends including John Buchan, and they suggested the plot of one of his books to Buchan. And Sybil sporadically continued to travel to South America with her husband, to Canada, and later in life to South Africa and Kenya. And in 1966, she died, aged 40, at her home in the New Forest.
She died at what age?
Sorry, I'm very sorry, aged 84.
Yeah, sorry. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. And how do you think your grandmother, Lady Sybil Middleton, would like to be remembered?
I think she'd like to be remembered as a true friend to her wide circle of friends and family. And her friend, Mab Jones, remembered her ready sympathy, her laughter, and the splendid clarity of her vision, and the wholesome astringency of her advice that was so good for one. And she's bound all her friends into a sort of goodly fellowship. And that's how I'd like to remember her too.
Well, sorry.
Now, I was going to say, and thank you all for listening. And her full story is told in my book. Please do read it. And the details are up on the screen from Hayloft Publishers. Anna.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Simon. You've given us a vivid descriptions of the events in the life of your Northumbrian grandmother. And when I read this complex, independent woman, about this complex, independent, very creative woman, I felt I'd absorbed some of the flavour of the remarkable times that she recorded and that you've so ably presented in your book and in your talk today. So please send your questions. Press the chat box, and Colin will put them to me. I must say, I will remember always. I'll take with me away from this the picture of the granny with the sword stick, and the picture of the granny making the flag out of a Father Christmas costume in Moscow, in Petrograd. So Simon's happy to answer any questions. Colin, over to you. Are you going to send me some questions? In the meantime, I have some questions I can put myself, which have come during the course of the talk. And one of the questions is this about your grandma. What did you enjoy most about researching and writing the book, please?
I very much preferred researching, actually, to writing, which I found very hard work. The research took maybe 5 years, and I kept on finding new and interesting things. It was a bit like going on the program, Who Do You Think You Are? And I knew certainly the basics. I knew that she was the daughter of Earl Grey, and I knew about her younger sister, Evie, and her brother, Charlie. But I didn't know her mother's name, for instance, which was Alice. And I didn't know that she had 2 other sisters who were who died, both of them untimely deaths. And I was interested to find out about her wider family, about the Elliots and the MacDonalds on her father's side, and the Parkers and the Lindsays on her mother's side. But I also enjoyed researching the places she lived in. So I was glad to visit Howick. I was very privileged to be shown around Howick. And her other homes, like Lowood in the borders of Scotland, and Canada, Ottawa, and Russia. I made 2 visits to Russia, and my wife came with me to Canada and Russia. So I enjoyed all of that. And then I had to actually knuckle down and do the writing, and that was much.
Thank you. Thank you. And we have some very interesting questions coming in here. So a useful question, who are actually the patients of the hospital? And who are the Russians fighting on the Eastern Front in the when she was in the field hospital? I believe that you do mention Kiev as well in the book. Who are the patients in the hospital in Petrograd, and who were the Russians fighting on the Eastern Front?
Yeah, okay. The patients were normally young Russian ordinary soldiers, and let's say that they weren't officers at all. And so many of them, almost none of them spoke English. And one of the things they did was to teach them English, but not in the field hospitals, which were concerned with binding up battle wounds. Sorry, you said who were the enemy? The enemy.
Who were they fighting? Yes, on the Eastern Front.
The Austro-Hungarians on the Eastern Front, but also they then came up against the Germans as well. The Germans were a much tougher proposition, actually.
And it follows, for a good question to follow that with is it known what Lady Sybil's view of the Bolsheviks was?
Well, she wasn't in Russia when the Bolsheviks took over. She'd left. I think she felt that, obviously, I don't think she was in favor of them. I think she felt that the whole of Russia had collapsed, and she would have considered it a tragedy. But as you can see, she wasn't in favor of the Tsar's regime either when it was on its last legs.
Yes, okay. And then a wider question, what do you think she considered her greatest achievement in Russia to be?
I suppose really her greatest achievement in a way was setting up the thing at the start, because she was the person deputed by the big committee go out and do that, and she had to be realistic. I mean, her lead doctor, Dr. Fleming, wanted to turn down this royal palace, but she said, there's nothing else on offer, and we're beggars can't be choosers. So I think setting it up was her big thing. But obviously, I'm sure she enjoyed being out in the field hospital as well.
Yes, I think so. And lots of comments saying what an amazing woman she certainly was. But we've just got time for a couple more questions, and so I'll pick some slightly different ones, which is, oh dear, where is her film Darnick now, Simon?
Well, I don't know is the answer. I haven't been able to find it, and I did actually ask the BBC, but they couldn't find it. Maybe relatives of mine have a copy, but I fancy it may have got lost, which is a great shame. Yes.
She was obviously very multi-talented, multi-creative, and I don't know if you would know the answer to this one, but someone's asking, is there a collection of her photos, a wider collection of her photos available? Because the photos in your book are very revealing of the time. And is there any other way people can see her photos?
I'm not sure how many of the ones which we screened are from taken by her, actually. And the answer is no, there isn't a collection of her photos, but she really was very taken with photography, and her diaries used to record the aperture and the timing and the film stock and all of this, so she was meticulous, but the actual many of the photos haven't survived either, sadly.
Again, a huge thanks to Simon for such an informative and interesting talk on his grandmother, Lady Sybil Grey of Northumberland. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, and thanks to all in the audience.